you see what I mean about the enlarging effect of poetry? I'm going to be talking about the practical side of waging peace. And the phrase waging peace comes from a former Republican president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And it's the title, I believe, of the second volume of his memoirs that we were honored to have several copies signed to a Republican governor of Minnesota. Oh, here we are. But the point is that we can take what would our world be like if we took waging peace to be of greater or equal value to the business of waging war. What kind of world might we live in? And Kristen reminded me that though I might get 52 years of experience waging peace, going back at least to the time when I was 16, you have several hundred. So when I'm done speaking, I'd like to hear from you. You've got plenty of time this morning. You've all had experience somewhere along the line with the difficult but necessary art of bringing peace to this world. I'd like to hear from you too. So I'm going to break my remarks into a couple of sections. One has to do with communication, which we are doing constantly as a species, and the other is action. So, 4 hints for peacemaking in communication. And if you studied nonviolent communication, this will probably sound quite familiar. Listen to understand, not just to argue. Wouldn't it be tragic to lose a good friendship or a member of your family just in order to win an argument? I find when I shift my attention from the logical structure of sentences to the deeper texture of words and gestures and silences and sighs, there's all kinds of information available to me which I can use artfully to deepen the relationship. And that leads to the second point. Reflect back some of what you hear. And the sum is there to acknowledge that when someone speaks to us, they're putting out thousands of bits of communication. We might be lucky enough to notice 10 and say something about 1 or 2. And this technique of simply reflecting back what someone says is remarkably effective. And it works even if you know the technique. Several years ago, Kristen was driving my hopped-up purple car, and a truck driver in training pulled suddenly in front of us, and I just went ballistic and started saying words that ministers are not supposed to know, but I know. And luckily there was a highway patrol there. If you've dealt with highway patrol in terms of education and training, they are the cream of the crop. And this young man pulled me over, and I didn't need any invitation. I started erupting with everything I thought was wrong with the truck driver. He said, "Yes, Theodore, I can tell you're very upset. And it really troubled you that not only was your wife driving the car, but she was driving your favorite car. How sad it would be if there was damage to you and your wife." He went on for about a minute, and I could feel the force of my anger being deflated by his skill. And it worked even though I understood the technique and even teach it in my classes. So rather than listening to argue and win, I invite you to sometimes listen to understand and then reflect back as your free gift some of what you heard, maybe with a question at the end. Third point, ask questions that invite the person to tell you a personal story. that is almost always there behind the belief, behind the argument, behind their position. How many of you have had a discussion with someone who upholds the principle that life is sacred and applies that mainly to fetuses? Okay, I've been there. You've probably been there. What I sometimes say is, I'm pro-life too, but I take a much broader view. I'm interested in the whole spectrum of human development and honoring it and protecting it and resourcing it at every stage. But an even better response might be to say, well, how did you arrive at that belief? What led you to make that principle so important? Who called you to that understanding? How do you live into that idea? And when I ask a question that invites deeper reflection, what I often get in return is a story, sometimes a very sad story in the case of abortion. And when stories are told, people don't fight, or maybe are less likely to fight. When stories are told and received with heartfelt listening, a bond is formed. And this is true in my extended family, where one of my dearly beloved relatives, who has a wonderful open heart, has chosen to focus her attention on the life of fetal tissue. Babies, she would say. Babies, not fetal tissue, babies. Human babies. And her great gift is the way that she has lived that. She adopts squirrels and brings them in and raises them. Her kids have rats and flying marsupials. So she's lived into that, and we have a shared understanding that life is sacred. So that's why it became a conscientious objector. Fourth tactic, very useful, especially in this divided culture that we seem to find ourselves in. We might be on the verge of the next civil war, except there may not be any bullet shot. We'll simply choose to separate. And that is to emphasize, whenever possible, emphasize common ground. Find something honest that you can praise. And I don't know what your neighborhood looks like. Our neighborhood has lots of flags on one side of the street, and I put, the banner form of the American flag on our fourth floor balcony just to confuse people. But we have one of our beloved neighbors has the younger brother who's always been a handful. And as we got close to the last presidential election, one after another, Trump signs began to appear on his brother's property, and they kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, after the fourth one, I rolled down the window and said, I may not agree with you in terms of who would make the best president, but I have to admire your grit, your gumption, and your persistence. Well, he looked in the window and stared at me. My hair was then considerably longer. He was not used to receiving praise from someone that looked like me. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, politics is a participatory sport, and you are out here day after day participating. I admire that. And we need that, because democracy is a participatory sport. It's not a spectator sport. That's 4 ideas about communication. Action, one of the keys to creative nonviolence is to identify with those who are several positions down on the social ladder, who are at a disadvantage. And a former member of this congregation may have saved the life of an African-American gentleman who was pulled over in Wisconsin by several police and then highway patrol. And what did she do? She stopped her car, she took out her cell phone, and she filmed the whole thing. She would not leave. And she filmed almost an hour of this interaction, and finally the police and the highway patrol left. And the gentleman came over and said, "Thank you, you might have saved my life." That's someone from this congregation who made a difference and just might have saved a life by caring for someone who was different from her and who was at an obvious disadvantage. Second pattern of action is to mobilize public demonstrations which reveal and dramatize the hard edges of injustice. And I remember watching on those little black and white television screens pictures from Selma, Alabama. Bull Connors, wasn't he in charge of the police? And there were black demonstrators led sometimes by Martin Luther King who dared to pray in public. They were greeted by police dogs and fire hoses. Night after night after night after night. We didn't believe it on Tuesday, we could watch it on Wednesday. I think those pictures of injustice dramatized eventually changed hearts and minds, including some of the police officers who, after several days, refused to release the police dogs even though they were told to, and several people from the fire department who refused to turn fire hoses on people because they were praying in public. Third principle is to claim and share the higher ground. And there's a wonderful cover from Saturday Evening Post that Norman Rockwell did many years ago, and it's many of the religions of the world represented by one person standing together, and above it is, or below it is the phrase, do unto one another as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule. Well, there's a wonderful new version of that I keep reposting on Facebook. All of those faces had masks just like yours. The implicit appeal to treat others as we wish to be treated, and to never make our freedom to mask or unmask more important than the life of another human being. And if you're talking to a member of your family who's conservative, you could even link it to the golden rule. Fourth, remember that sometimes your apparent adversary holds the key to transformation. Think about COVID-19. Many of us are vaccinated. Some of us are already boosted. Most of us wear masks in public, and we have to. The unvaccinated appear to hold the key to whether this pandemic ends or not. I mean, there's only so many shots we can receive. There's only so many layers of a mask we can wear. There's only so many social occasions we can give up, and I'm not prepared to give up this kind of occasion. Our friends, our neighbors, our families who are choosing for many reasons not to get vaccinated may hold the key to whether this pandemic ends in 6 months or never. So those are my practical thoughts. I want to give you some good news from Lao Tzu and then harvest your reflections. The good news from Lao Tzu, remember about if there's peace in the world, there must be peace among nations, and so far, it works its way down to peace in our hearts and minds. And in Chinese, Xin, one word, means both heart and mind. What an interesting culture that refuses to divide those two. When I studied that text, and as I've worked to translate it for over almost 20 years now, I used to assume that what the text meant was that the peace in the heart and mind was most important. That was the key to everything. And of course, for a raving introvert, that makes perfect sense. However, experience the interdependent web of all existence of which we are part, there's another way of reading that text, and that is that all the levels are richly interdependent. And here's the good news for those of us that practice waging peace. If we wage peace skillfully and persistently at any level, the waves of peace will spread to all the other levels. If, indeed, this world is an interdependent web of which we are a part. So that's good news. And if you have an Aunt Grace, who I used to have, who will call you this afternoon and say, well, Anna, what was the message of the sermon today? You could say, well, peacemaking involves us, and a change at one level creates changes at many levels. So I want to pause now and harvest. This is the time of harvest after all. Harvest some of your discoveries about the art of waging peace. Either patterns of communication or patterns of action. And I'm not going to argue with anything, I just want you to note it and receive it so that my contributions are enriched by yours. So the floor is open for your discoveries about making peace. Yes, Susan.
Yes, we have in our extended family have a relative that seems to like to create chaos and be disagreeable. And by one, many of the family members are just, when they identify the call that's coming from her, they won't take it. But her mother, who's a close relative of mine, they're afraid not to. They want to know if anything's happened to this person, that that's what the call might be about. So they call me, and no, she's fine, it's something else, and it kind of leads to a nice conversation with that person. But I'm one of the few that will take the calls from the disagreeable person. And I used to try and reason with her, or when she give me all this chaotic problem she has, I give her suggestions, but she wouldn't even hear them, wouldn't listen and hear. So I just listen, let her go on and on and on, and I clean the cupboards while this is going on, or do something. But I was hearing, sort of. But finally she would wind down at some point, and maybe there was some peace for her there.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is just listening sometimes.
Just
really
listening.
does work.
There's no point in giving me advice. She never follows it and disagrees with anything you say. But just listening, she kind of sorts some of it out and is more at peace.
Sometimes when just giving people a chance to speak aloud at length, they will discover the wisdom that they need from their own words. Which is actually what the Dalai Lama suggests, is just keep silence and listen.
A follow-up on that is that her state seems to be deteriorating. So I finally did say, I'm here to listen, but I can't give you enough trained advice. Go to maybe a counselor that could really help you professionally, that could give you better advice than I could.
Sometimes we can act as a bridge. We don't have to do it all. We can act as a bridge to people who are actually trained to listen skillfully, reflect back, make suggestions, share images, and so forth. How about one other discovery from the peacemakers in the world? What's worked for you? Yes.
I'm remembering here in our community when it was kind of the lead up to the Iraq War with W. People came together and we did frequent walks down Main Street, and then we'd end up at the Journey House right next to
Yeah.
the university
Yeah.
and have a meal together. And that was also a good time of meeting other people in the community and supporting each other.
Yeah. Sometimes walking together and breaking bread together is the most powerful thing we can do. And actually, the word for companion means those who break bread together. So, like, as a former president said, something, just keep it simple. He said a little more. He said, just keep it simple. How about one more hint from experienced peacemakers? Yes, David.
It's not about peacemaking, but more about your four corners for peace. It seems to me that they don't go in one direction.
Yeah.
So truth is often moves you a long way away from peace, and that it's frequently a rearrangement of your understanding of the world or something, and that's highly unpeaceful.
Yeah.
Unsettles you, and love is both, a reflection or leads to peace, but it also leads to great distress sometimes.
Yeah.
So these things which move towards peace can also be entropic, at least in the short term.
Yeah, every one of these probably has two sides. And, in the hands of Gandhi or Dr. King, some of the training was how to demonstrate and bring shalom, peace with justice to the world by public demonstrations. But in both traditions, there was extensive coaching about a spiritual practice. So peacemakers were trained to deal with what came up when somebody was in your face and shot. I know what comes up for me. I keep looking for that 1-inch punch. That Bruce Lee made famous. But so there's always another side to these qualities. Each of them is both a gift and a challenge. And let's face it, some days the work of waging peace may be beyond this. I want to end with some good news. And if you're familiar with the Sermon on the Mount, and you brought your Bibles with you, Unitarians, that's chapters 5 through 7 of the book of Matthew. The part of the chant we're going to do together is, Blessed are the peacemakers. Let's try that together.
Blessed are the peacemakers.
And I'm going to add some texture to that in between. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who agitate and demonstrate to end wars and establish peace with justice.
Blessed are the peacemakers.
Blessed are those who meditate and resonate with deep harmonic chords of peace as harmony and unity. Om, sweet Om. Blessed
are the peacemakers.
Blessed are the gardeners and the wild herbalists who befriend this world, giving thanks and harvesting, so that the deep peace of belonging may heal us.
Blessed are the peacemakers.
Blessed are the poets and the troubadours who plant the seeds of peace and hope in our hearts, in our minds, and in our communities. Blessed
are the peacemakers.
Nancy, you're going to guide us out. I have a feeling it will include some wonderful words of closing and a song.
Thank you. Thank you, Ted. We'll sing Peace Like a River, and then we will have announcements, and then we will do our closing words. And if you would please stand if you're able, and let's do a little rollicking. Let's pick it up from the